Thank you to Official Help Canet, The Labyrinth Maker, Robert Nielsen, Cleo3392, Norigveldi, Homemade Movies, Obras del Gabetto, and Alex Rules VGCP for requesting this episode.
Esperanto. Welcome to Conlang Critic, the show biggest extra about your favorite Conlang. I'm Misali, and in this episode, we'll be looking at our Hopper's English language, Esperanto.
I briefly considered doing that voice the entire time, but honestly, that would just be more annoying than anything. At the very least, it would help me stand out among everyone else who's talked about the flaws in Esperanto. There is basically nothing that I can say in this video that hasn't been said before by people who are more qualified than I am. And anything I say that hasn't been said multiple times is going to require a disclaimer. Like, when I translated Esperanto as Hopper just now, I guarantee that someone is going to correct me on that and say that Esperanto means one who hopes and not Hopper, as though there's a significant difference between those two things, even though I'm currently saying that I'm fully aware of the way it's usually translated and simply chose to translate it as Hopper instead. The fact that I needed to say that shows just how many things there are that make it difficult to critically talk about Esperanto in any meaningful way. However, Esperanto is basically the conlang. It wouldn't make sense for me to keep doing this show about conlangs without talking about Esperanto eventually, even though it's not going to come anywhere close to covering everything. So, I might as well do it now, starting by saying, Esperanto is an international auxiliary language created by the late Dr. L. Laser Z in 1887. As an IAL, it was designed to be easy to learn and use regardless of your first language. That little fact about what interlangs are supposed to be was the basis for my highly controversial claim about how good Togipona is in the previous episode. However, I don't think it's as big of a deal to say that Esperanto is meant to be easy to learn. Dr. L. Laser Z himself said that the primary goal of Esperanto was, and I quote, to render the study of the language so easy as to make its acquisition mere play to the learner. In the 130 years since its creation, Esperanto has gained a huge following, with millions of Esperantists around the world, as well as thousands of native Esperanto speakers. Hey, remember 8 episodes ago when I said I'd eventually discuss the Esperantist consonant inventory and how it's been copied a lot and is sort of treated like the gold standard for internationalized phonology? Well, here it is. M, n, b, d, g, p, t, k, j, c, ch, f, z, j, f, s, sh, h, h, w, l, y, r. This consonant inventory has been copied time and time again by conlangers who want to make interlangs, under the assumption that Dr. Laser did his research when making this. Sometimes they'll remove a couple of sounds like the alveolar affricate or the velar fricative, but the main features keep showing up. 2 nasals, 6 stops, a z-j distinction, and of course, the whatever rhotic. The letter R in Esperanto is officially an alveolar trill, but it's sorta allowed to be pronounced however you pronounce the letter R in your native language. Some people say that that's not true and that it should only ever be the alveolar trill, but the English version of La Fundamento says that R is pronounced as in rare, without any mention of it being trilled. Even though this notion has been mostly abandoned by the Esperanto community, it's still an influential aspect, and it's given as the official pronunciation of the rhotics in languages like Lojban and Novial. The biggest problem with the whatever rhotic is that it automatically creates a divide in the speaking community, where it's immediately obvious what someone's first language is if they pronounce the rhotic a certain way. Not to mention the fact that not every language even has a rhotic sound. A whole lot of sounds in this consonant inventory are really uncommon. According to Foible Online, 5 of these consonants appear in less than a third of all languages. The voiced post-alveolar affricate, the voiced alveolar fricative, the voiceless alveolar affricate, and the voiceless velar fricative. If Esperanto took how common sounds are cross-linguistically into account, the inventory would look something like this instead. Esperanto does not, however, have this inventory, and instead has one that's very likely to contain sounds that aren't in your first language. Esperanto's vowels are I, U, E, O, A. This is yet another example of the classic 5-vowel system, which I've already spoken about a few times, so I have nothing new to say about it here. Now, I usually don't talk about diphthongs because there usually isn't that much to say about them, but Esperanto's diphthongs are notably dumb. I, ow, a, eu, oi, ui. Like, what? Why? What language even has all of these? Seriously, what's the most common language that's actually compatible with Esperanto's phonology? Mandarin doesn't have v, most dialects of English don't have ch, and even those that do are still missing ui. Spanish doesn't have h, Arabic doesn't have o, Hindi doesn't have ch, Malay doesn't have j, Russian doesn't have h, French doesn't have j, Portuguese doesn't have ch, Bengali doesn't have ch, Urdu doesn't have ch, Punjabi doesn't have j, Japanese doesn't have r, Persian doesn't have ts, Swahili doesn't have j, Telugu doesn't have h, German doesn't have a, Italian doesn't have j, Javanese doesn't have sh, Tamil doesn't have v, Korean doesn't have j, Wu doesn't have k, Marathi doesn't have ch, Turkish doesn't have ts, Vietnamese doesn't have j, and UA doesn't have z. That's as far as the Wikipedia article list of languages by total number of speakers goes, and every single language on the list is incompatible with Esperanto's phonology in some way. And I didn't even look at syllable structure, which by the way is pretty poorly defined, so you end up with a lot of words with difficult consonant clusters like C. This should be unacceptable. Like, I went through 26 languages, all of which have over 60 million speakers, and not a single one is compatible with Esperanto's phonology. You know what language is compatible with Esperanto's phonology? Polish, which happens to be Dr. Laser's native language. As for the orthography, well, this is the single easiest problem to notice about Esperanto. But I'm gonna say it anyway. Hey, what's with the diacritics? Esperanto has 6 letters that are written with diacritics, and also has 4 letters of the Latin alphabet that it doesn't use. Now, I don't mind that it doesn't use Q and Y, since that's more of a style choice, but the fact that it doesn't use W and X, even though it has the sounds that they represent in the IPA, is so dumb. To be fair, Esperanto is a bit older than the IPA, but that still doesn't excuse the fact that the labiovelar approximant isn't written with W. Other than the fact that they exist, there's still a couple of dumb things about the diacritics. Mainly, there isn't any sort of internal logic to what exactly they mean. Like, the circumflex means post-alveolar on C circumflex and S circumflex, so you'd think that the sound j would be written with Z circumflex, but nope, it's J circumflex. And then, since there isn't a voiced version of t in Esperanto, that trend needed to be abandoned anyway for the voiced post-alveolar affricate. And of course, once it was time to make a symbol for the W sound that couldn't be written with a W for some reason, the circumflex wasn't used at all. Esperanto's grammar is needlessly complicated. There's so much stuff that's done with inflectional morphology that easily could have been done with word order, like the accusative case. Not only are nouns in the accusative case given a suffix, but the same suffix is also put on adjectives. The same thing applies to the plurality suffix. You sometimes even get both suffixes at the same time. There's actually no reason to do this. The object of a sentence can be easily indicated through word order, and adjectives are already required to be adjacent to the nouns they modify, so what the heck? All this does is make it harder to learn. I would go into the grammar a bit more, but honestly, I just have so much more to say about the vocabulary that I just want to get to it as soon as possible. The vocabulary is very bad. First of all, it's super Eurocentric. Most of it's from Romance languages, except it doesn't use words from Spanish for some reason, even though Spanish is the most commonly spoken Romance language. It has a decent amount of words from Germanic languages, but they're frequently not pronounced very much like they are in the languages they're taken from. Biero doesn't sound like beer, and suno doesn't sound like sun. On top of that, Esperanto kinda just ignores various words that are pretty international, like hospital, and canine, and feminine. Oh, also, notice how the word for female, virina, is derived from the word for male, vira, with a suffix added onto it. People do sometimes just say ina, but the way Dr. Laser intended Esperanto to be spoken had people calling women like men but female. That's how Esperanto treats women in every situation. A word for a type of woman is derived from a word for a type of man with the in suffix added, with actually no exceptions even for extremely basic things like mother and girl. There's been some efforts to fix this, but none of them are officially part of Esperanto, and they still don't excuse the fact that this problem exists in the first place. Sexism is just one of the negative results that come from Esperanto's derivational system. Esperanto tries to minimize its vocabulary by using compound words whenever possible, such as the examples already shown. One of the most common ways Esperanto does this is with the prefix mal, meaning opposite. You know, like in vodka. There's a few problems with it, though. First of all, since so much of Esperanto's vocabulary is from Romance languages, it makes sense that people would assume mal means bad, which leads people to believe that any word that starts with mal is being called bad. However, the thing I think is the least excusable about Esperanto's vocabulary is the inconsistent way it handles toponyms. First of all, the words are very rarely derived from endonyms. Most of the time, you're going to need to learn a new name for the place you live in order to speak Dr. Hooper's international language, which might not even be a particularly international word. Like, people from Germany are typically at least somewhat familiar with the Latin word Germania, so they can probably understand why the name of their country is Germanil. But I, a person from the United States, first heard the word Usonian when I looked up the etymology for what Esperanto expects me to call my country, Usono. It gets worse, though. Someone from Japan might be familiar with the English name of their country, but it's far less likely that they'd still recognize it after the pronunciation is changed to Japanil. But on top of the strangeness of where the names even come from, there's also the inconsistency of how the roots are used. Sometimes the root on its own refers to a person, like Anglo, which means an English person, and then you add a suffix to refer to the country. Quick side note, that suffix used to be uyo, which is the container suffix, so England was Angluyo, or container for English people. That suffix has been abandoned for country names, and it was replaced with one of 3 new suffixes, io, lando, or stano, and you just need to memorize which one you're supposed to use. Anyway, that's only for some country names. For the rest of them, the main root on its own refers to a country, like Kanado, which means Canada, and you add a suffix, ano, which means a person from. So Canadian is Kanadano. So just to recap, there's 4 distinct ways that any individual toponym works, and there's no consistent way of knowing which one to use without looking it up. All in all, I feel like Esperanto fails at its goals. It isn't international, and it isn't very easy to learn. Don't get me wrong, it's a fine language, it's just that there's so much there that would be so easy to fix. That in mind, I'd say that I like Esperanto more than I like Lojban, but not as much as Togipona, making it the second best interlang reviewed so far. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, where I'll be reviewing Edo.
Fikik 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 juju juj fikik 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 fix Esperanto folk CPFC KHC PFC KHC PFC KHC PFC KHC PFC KHC PFC KHC PFC KH Kujuju juj fuel to Conlang Critic. Isudejas fex rehabaj or favorj Conlang, Ijmayan misalj, and Esepsud, Uil Belukan Dakter Halpers Inner Ninland Gig, Esperanto.